Have you ever wondered why some photos just pop while others look kind of dull? And 99% of the time, the reason is contrast. But not just contrast in light and dark. Contrast can be found in color, in feelings, and even in the story of your photo. So, in this video, I'm going to break down how to use contrast in tone, color, and even in concepts. So, after watching, you'll be able to use contrast as a tool not only to make your photos pop, but to elevate your visual storytelling. So, if it's not just light and dark, what exactly is contrast? And how can we use it in our photography? So, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, contrast is an obvious difference between two or more things. Now, this, of course, isn't a photography definition, and the Cambridge Dictionary is not a source for artistic terminology, but it gives us a first idea of the basic meaning of contrast. But I still wanted to find out what contrast means in photography terms. So I turned to a book called The Photographer's Eye by Michael Freeman. In it, Freeman explains that contrast is a key part of visual design and that our modern understanding of it was heavily influenced by the Bauhaus University and especially by someone named Johannes Itten. Itten was a painter, art teacher, and one of the main instructors at the Bauhaus University, which has trained many of the most influential artists and designers of the 20th century. Itten defined many different kinds of contrast, like light versus dark, or big versus small, smooth versus rough, or even contrast in emotions and feelings. And there may be lots of different types of contrasts, but it's fair to say that contrast can be categorized into three main categories. And these are tonal contrast, which refers to the contrast between light and dark, color contrast, meaning the contrast between color or hues, and lastly, conceptual contrast, which covers the contrast or the difference between ideas and meanings, like old versus new or man versus nature. And in the following, I will break down how these different types of contrast influence our photo and our story, and I'll give you some examples to see how these types of contrasts actually look. Let's start with the first type of contrast, being tonal contrast. This refers to the difference between light and dark portions in our image. This works so well because naturally the human eye is drawn to the brightest portions of the image. So if we combine these with darker portions of the image, we can highlight our subject and direct the attention of our viewer. Okay, one example of tonal contrast is this photo, which is very clearly a silhouette and a very exaggerated example of tonal contrast. For this case, I wanted just to underline the point that tonal contrast in its most basic form is the contrast between dark and light portions. So in this photo, you can see the silhouette contrasted with the very bright sky. So my intention for this photo was to simplify it because, to be transparent, I edited this photo to make the dark portions look much darker. So in reality, it didn't look this dark, especially the person and the foreground, which is basically black. But in this case, I decided to make the darker parts really dark because they still had some elements like texture, for example, which was kind of distracting and pulling focus away from the person and the idea of this photo, which is a person sitting somewhere in a park, and these stones on the in the bottom half of the image and their texture, they didn't help the story of the photo. So I decided to basically hide them by using contrast. Okay, so in this example, it's the other way around. So our subject, the falling leaves, are bright and the background is dark. And this kind of contrast is very important because if the background was very bright, we wouldn't be able to see the falling leaves, and this whole image would have a different vibe, and it wouldn't be about falling leaves because you wouldn't be able to see them. So this type of contrast, the tonal contrast, enables us to see our subject and to really highlight it. And another thing is that this photo, if you look at the bottom, it's rather bright and we have lots of falling leaves. And if you look at the top, there's also lots of bright leaves and a bright sky. And the most contrasty area is in the middle where the falling leaves are, which is intentional because this is the area that looks most different from the top and the bottom of the image, which is very similar. So by contrasting the middle of the image, where our subject is, with the top and bottom portion, which is kind of the same, we can highlight our subject again and tell the story of these leaves falling. Okay, when it comes to the impact of tonal contrast on our photography, there's mainly three things. Firstly, it helps us simplify our composition, meaning that we can hide distracting things in the shadows to make our photo easier to understand. Secondly, we can use contrast to create visual hierarchy and to make the viewer know which portion of the image they are supposed to look at. And by knowing that the human eye is drawn to the brightest portions, we can use that knowledge and contrast our subject with the brightest portions or with the darkest portions if our subject is the brightest portion. And we combine these two to create the highest visual contrast, which demands the most visual attention. And lastly, contrast can help create a certain kind of mood. So a very intense amount of contrast or a very high amount of contrast can make a scene feel more intense and also more dramatic, whereas a lower amount of contrast can make a scene feel much more calm and peaceful. Okay, next up is color contrast, meaning a difference between two colors. And one of the most popular kinds of color contrast is using complementary colors. This means that you could use two kinds of colors that are on opposite sides of the color wheel. Now, what this does is create a sense of balance because these colors complement each other. Two of the most popular complementary colors are teal and orange. And because it's so popular, I would advise you to not overuse this. But of course, when you're outdoors shooting, you can always influence which colors you have. But I would suggest that you focus on one color in your composition and contrast the other elements against it. Okay, so in this example, we have mainly two colors, orange and blue. And these colors are not exactly opposites on the color wheel, but I think it's fair to say that they are different enough from each other and far away enough from each other on the color wheel to be considered complementary colors. So what this does is that these warm tones and these cool tones, they kind of complement each other and they balance each other out, making this photo look visually appealing. Now, if we did not have this contrast and we had a photo that was monochromatic, meaning that we only had a blue photo, this photo would have a very different meaning and a very different feeling to it. It would feel much colder and not as balanced. If this photo was very orange, of course, it may feel warmer, but it would also feel kind of unnatural and it would feel like the sky was burning and it would feel much more dramatic and kind of off also. So by using the color contrast in this photo, I was able to create a sense of balance that kind of helps calm the scene down and make it feel visually appealing. Okay, in this photo, we also have color contrast, also a kind of orange and bluish mix. But there is one key difference here, and that is that these colors are a lot less punchier, meaning that this orange in the bottom right is much brighter and the contrast is not as intense as in the previous image. And the blue colors also are much more muted, although in the top left, of course, they begin to become a little darker. And this does two things. For one, it again creates a visual appeal and it creates a sense of balance because the top left is very blue and very cold, and the bottom right becomes much warmer. So there's a kind of balance between these two sides. But what's also important here is that this scene is much calmer compared to the previous scene, meaning that the previous scene was a sunset and it wasn't a hectic photo, but it still had a more dramatic feeling to it. Whereas this photo feels much calmer, which is the feeling I was going for when photographing these birds, which kind of represent nature and a kind of calm feeling during a sunrise. So the key difference here is the intensity of contrast. So when it comes to the effect of color contrast on our photography, it for one creates a visual appeal, especially when using complementary colors. Secondly, it can create a kind of balance, especially if you use colors that are again on the opposite side of the color wheel and contrasting warm tones with cooler tones. And lastly, color contrast can impact the overall mood of your photo, meaning that very punchy colors can create a sense of dramaticness, and very bright colors can create a feeling of peacefulness and calm. Okay, so next up is conceptual contrast, which again means a contrast in ideas or meanings. Now, this is of course rather vague, and this could relate to a difference between old and new, for example, or the difference between man and nature, or the difference between shapes, like curved lines and straight lines. Now, this is, of course, very difficult because this leaves us with the challenge to find these contrasting things. But this is also an opportunity because as photographers, we are creatives. And as creatives, it's our job to communicate our ideas. And by using conceptual contrast, we can, for one, focus on a certain characteristic within our composition and contrast it with any other element within the composition, meaning that we can focus on an idea and communicate this idea by using this type of contrast. But let's have a look at some examples to make this more clear. Okay, so I took this photo in Tokyo and I tried to contrast these traditional temples with these modern skyscrapers. So the idea is contrasting old with new or tradition with modernity. And this is not just a visually appealing look for me, this is also a way to communicate an idea of Japanese society, meaning that I'm trying to highlight the idea that Japanese society has a lot of traditions that are held up, but also this country is very modern, especially when it comes to technology. So there's kind of this duality in Japanese society between tradition and modernity. And by using contrast in this way was my attempt to kind of communicate this idea. Okay, so in this photo, I used a couple of different kinds of contrast. So for one, we have the contrast between the sky and the ground with the color contrast, meaning that the sky has very warm colors and the ground has rather cool colors. But the more important contrast here is the conceptual contrast between the bird and these power plants, which are marked by these tall chimneys. And this, for me, kind of represents this classical contrast between nature and industry, or nature and man made structures. And this is kind of a way to highlight that these two are at odds. But there is one more subtle contrast, and that is, for one, in the sky, where the bird has a lot of negative space around it, meaning that there's just a lot of free space, which creates this feeling of freedom, which I connect with birds and with nature in general. And if we look at the ground, these power plants, they look cramped together, which kind of gives me the feeling of producing more and more and taking up more and more space and giving a feeling of having limited space left, which again contrasts with the feeling of freedom in the sky. So this is basically the idea. And this is a way to use contrast to kind of portray these ideas and to communicate these ideas with your viewers. Okay, so when it comes to the effects of conceptual contrasts, there's four things I found. So for one, it helps us communicate an idea or a message. Secondly, it adds to the depth of the story of your photo. And thirdly, it makes the viewer think or ask questions. And lastly, it can create layers of meaning. So you could combine different types of contrasts or different intensities of contrasts, like very obvious contrasts and some more subtle types of contrasts. Okay, so lastly, I want to give you 3 tips on how you can use contrast to actually impact the visual appeal of your photos and also the story of your photo. So tip number 1, use contrast to guide the viewer's eye and simplify the scene, meaning that by hiding elements that are distracting in the shadows, and by combining our subject with either the brightest or the darkest portions of the image, so our subject can stand out, we make it easier for the viewer to understand what the photo is about. Secondly, control the contrast to shape the mood of your image. So this relates to color contrast, for example, where you can use two opposite colors and combine them to create visual appeal and also give a sense of balance to your photo. And here it's very important to notice the intensity, meaning if you have very punchy colors, you can create a more dramatic mood, or if you use more muted colors, you can create a sense of balance, peacefulness. Okay, so this is it for contrast. If you found this video helpful, let me know by liking the video and sharing it with someone you think could use this video. And if you don't want to miss more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing. Other than that, I hope this video helped you create with more intention, and I see you next time.